Hi, my name's Kim Geiselman. I'm one of the RNs that's going to go over some patient information related to dominant and recessive genetic disorders. Before we can discuss some dominant and genetic disorders, I think we need just some review on some common genetic terms that you're going to hear along the way. DNA is the master molecule that's in every cell, and it contains the information or the code for each individual that is passed on from generation to generation. If the DNA changes for some reason, some serious problems can occur. The DNA then wraps tightly together to form what we call chromosomes. Each human has 23 pairs of chromosomes that are always located in the nucleus of each cell. Each pair of chromosomes, you get one half from the mother and the other half from your father, and then these genes are what give you your individual traits. The 23rd chromosome is different from all the rest in that one is the X chromosome and one is the Y chromosome. X denotes if you're a girl and Y if you're a boy. The genes are segments along the DNA on the chromosomes that provide information that gives us our individual traits like brown eyes, blue eyes, things like that. Along the genes, each gene has different alleles. And the alleles are basically just different forms of the genes. We get two copies of each of our genes, one from our mom and one from our dad, and each of these copies are an allele. And we'll get into alleles here in a little bit more when we discuss some of the terms. The instructions that we get from our mom can be different than the instructions we get from our dad. And these different instructions produce slightly different proteins, and that's why you can have brown hair and your sister has blonde hair, and we get all that information from our parents. Dominant traits are proteins that are stronger or more dominant and win out over the weaker proteins, and that's the weaker proteins are known as recessive traits. A dominant trait will show up regardless. Whether there's a recessive trait or not, the recessive trait will be hidden. If mother has brown eyes, which is dominant, and the father has green eyes, which is recessive, the alleles for green eyes are recessive and the allele for brown eyes is dominant, I'm going to have brown eyes because it's a dominant trait, and the dominant trait always wins over the recessive unless there are two recessive traits that come together. In order for the recessive trait to show, both parents must have the recessive trait. Red hair is a recessive trait. So if mom gives me the recessive trait or the allele for red hair and dad gives me the recessive trait, then I'm going to have red hair. So if you remember, if a dominant allele is present, the recessive trait remains hidden. Some common genetic orders that you hear about are sickle cell anemia, which is an autosomal recessive disorder, cystic fibrosis, which is also an autosomal recessive disorder. Huntington's disease is an autosomal dominant disorder. Down syndrome is basically the 21st chromosome has an extra one, so you actually have 23 of the 21st chromosomes. Hemophilia is an X-linked recessive disorder, and we're going to discuss X-linked disorders later on. Some of this can get complicated, so we're going to go over some different genetic disorder terms. Genetic disorders are caused by mutated genes. They can be autosomal, meaning on the regular chromosome, or they can be X-linked, where they're on the 23rd or the sex-linked chromosome. Genetic disorders can be inherited. They can be caused by environmental things such as exposure to radiation, whether it be artificial radiation from the sun where you could get skin cancer, or radiation from some type of a nuclear treatment plant, and then you can also get all kinds of genetic mutations from that. Chemical exposure is another environmental cause, such as asbestos. A lot of people who worked around asbestos years ago got mesothelioma, which is a form of lung cancer. we also can get mutated genes just through the normal aging process. And we can get skin cancer and things like that from the normal aging process. In order to determine what the predictability is of somebody getting something or inheriting something, we use a Punnett square. The Punnett square helps us determine the probability or the occurrence of a trait occurring. Capital letter, when you see a capital letter like you see here, the A, capital A, denotes dominance, and the small lowercase a denotes a recessive trait. So AA is called homozygous, meaning we have both the same, two dominant A's or alleles, and big A, little a is heterozygous, meaning we have one of each, and that's a carrier. And then we have little a, that's homozygous, but little a is recessive, as we stated earlier. Here's an example of an autosomal dominant disorder. We've all heard of Huntington's disease, or more commonly known as Huntington's chorea. In this Punnett square, you will see a big H. The big H denotes something that's dominant, and the little h denotes a recessive disorder. So in this example here, when these two come together, we have a dominant disorder for Huntington's disease. And when this and this come together, we also have a dominant disorder. When the two recessive orders come together here, and we have two little h's and two little h's, those two people do not have the disease. These two do, because why? As we said before, the dominant trait always wins out over the recessive trait. So here in this parent, the normal parent has the recessive gene, doesn't show. The parent that actually has Huntington's disease has the dominant H, and so in this case, when these two people mate, they have a 50-50 chance of having one child with the disease and one child without. An autosomal recessive disorder, like cystic fibrosis, also sickle cell, is a autosomal recessive disorder. You see in this one, we have mom and dad are both carriers for cystic fibrosis. And so big C, little c, big C, little c, means they're both carriers. When we look down here at how we predict the outcome of who will have what, we look here and we take and we break down mom and dad. Mom is always on top and dad is on the side. So here we have two dominant C's. Here, when we put these two together, we have an unaffected carrier, because in order for an autosomal recessive disorder, and think about recessive, in order to be recessive, we have to have the lowercase letters. So in this case, we have, this is a dominant disorder, not a recessive trait. So we have no carrier and no, the child's not affected by the disorder. Here we have a dominant trait and we have a recessive trait, meaning it's the same as mom and dad. These two children will be carriers, and then here we have the recessive trait. So we have the recessive from the mom, the recessive from the dad. This will be a child who is affected by cystic fibrosis. X-linked disorders are a different kind of genetic disorders, and what that means is they're on the sex chromosome, the chromosome that's denoted X and Y. But when we talk about an X-linked disorder, the mutation is always on the X, which is the female chromosome. And so X-linked disorders come from the mutation on the X chromosomes, meaning that this order affects males more severely than females. And why is that? Because females have two X chromosomes, meaning they have a backup. Even if one of the X-linked chromosomes is mutated, they still have another X that's a backup. And so more often than not, the normal gene will compensate for the mutated gene. Males, unfortunately, only have an X and a Y, and so if the X is affected and mutated, they have no backup. They only have a Y, and therefore they will be more symptomatic than women. And men's cases, when they get an X-linked disorder, it's far more serious and most times lethal for men. Why do X-linked disorders affect males more severely than females? Families with X-linked dominant disorders frequently have affected females and males in each generation. However, there is no male-to-male transmission, and that can be a little confusing, but we have to go back and think that women have two X's and men have an XY. So when you have X-linked disorder, and like we said before, the guys have no backup, and so then anything that's X-linked will definitely affect males more often than females. Families a lot of times will have affected male and female children, but rarely do the females show outward symptoms. And again, just so you understand, the difference between X-linked dominant and X-linked recessive is that if both parents are carriers, one male child will be affected. A male and female could be carriers, and then you'll have a female that's completely unaffected. And you can see an example here in hemophilia, which is an X-linked disorder. Here you have a father who doesn't have hemophilia. Here you have the mother who's the carrier, and the carrier gene is denoted by pink here on the X, the primary X chromosome. Down here, when these two parents mate, you'll see that when this Y and this normal X come together to make the male, you have one son without it. And you have a daughter who gets an X from dad and the affected mutated hemophilia gene from mom. You have a daughter who's a carrier. Then we have a son who gets X from mom and Y from dad. X is always dominant over Y, so this affected XY scenario here, this son will have hemophilia. This daughter gets the normal X, sorry about that, gets the normal X from mom and the normal X from dad. She will not have hemophilia and she will not be a carrier. Here we have a different scenario where the X is affected on the dad's gene and mom is completely normal. The red denotes the carrier for the chromosome carrying the hemophilia trait. So in this case, with the X being dominant, you can see here that we have a dominant X that's normal and a dominant X that is the hemophilia carrier. So we have in this case two normal offspring children, and if you look back at the other one, when we have an X that's affected and an X that's not, then that person will be a carrier. So when these two parents come together and produce offspring, the two males will not be a carrier and not show the disease. The two females will be carriers for hemophilia. This ends our slide presentation on dominant and recessive disorders for the autosome and for the X-linked. And I know that's complicated, but it's a lot to take in, and if you want, you can restart the video and watch it again to try and grasp it a little bit better the second time. Thank you.